Muy bienvenidos todos a esta sesión sabatina, un 9/11, un día importante en la historia de nuestras ciudades, en la historia también de la arquitectura, en la historia de Occidente. Y hoy vamos a tener una plática que forma parte de todo el programa del Festival de Arquitectura y Ciudad Mextrópoli. Va a ser en inglés, así lo anunciamos, espero que nadie se sorprenda en este punto. Y es una de las actividades que forman parte de este festival, como algunas exposiciones que pueden ver en mextropoli.mx y otras conferencias ya presenciales que vamos a tener a finales de este mes. Estén atentos a la información en mextropoli.mx. No los vamos a entretener ahora con más detalles. Y quisiera ya dar la bienvenida a Leo Tremblay. Él es jefe de misión adjunto de la Embajada de Suiza en México, un aliado estratégico fundamental para nosotros. Algunas embajadas, muy pocas en el mundo, saben la importancia que tiene la arquitectura y cómo forma parte de nuestra cultura y va más allá de simplemente de los edificios. Es un modo de crear lazos, de generar cultura, de establecer vínculos. Y qué mejor ahora que México y Suiza están celebrando los 75 años. Muy bienvenido, Leo, y te voy a dar la palabra para que puedas presentar a nuestro conferencista de hoy, queridísimo Bernard Tschumi, franco-suizo de nacimiento. Gracias, Leo.
Sí, buenas tardes a todas y todos. Muchas gracias, Miguel, para darme la palabra. Obviamente estamos muy emocionados poder presentar en el contexto muy conocido y reconocido de Mextrópoli a un arquitecto suizo y un poco francés tan destacado como Bernard Tschumi. Y para la embajada estamos muy emocionados de estar aquí, de poder apoyar y patrocinar esta conferencia, porque Bernard Tschumi, como arquitecto, como persona, representa mucho y exporta también en todos los lugares y los rincones del mundo valores suizos que para nosotros son muy importantes. La exactitud, el valor social, el empeño social, la conservación de los recursos, que siempre se vuelve más y más importante, la importancia por el trabajo bien hecho y también todo el trabajo académico, que es el trabajo de compartir los valores. Y como lo dijiste muy bien, Miguel, también este evento de hoy cabe en una serie muy larga de eventos de los 75 años que nosotros desarrollamos bajo el lema tradición, innovación y valores. Porque a veces Suiza tiene una reputación de ser un país de tradición, las montañas, el chocolate bien hecho, los relojes, obviamente, pero más allá, creo que a lo largo de la historia siempre hemos tenido personas que partiendo de los valores pudieron presentar cosas muy innovativas en ese sentido. Creo que los arquitectos son los mejores representantes de esta combinación del bien hecho y de la innovación. Y obviamente Bernard Tschumi es hoy en día uno de los arquitectos más reconocidos al nivel mundial, que nació en Lausanne, en el cantón de Vaud, pero quería también destacar que él se inscribe en una larga tradición de arquitectos suizos destacados que también partieron de Suiza para proponer una nueva perspectiva al mundo. Voy solo a mencionar algunos porque no quieren escuchar a mí, pero a Bernard. Le Corbusier, que es suizo, que también fue francés, pero que nació en Suiza. Borromini, que hizo sus obras en Roma, pero que nació en Ticino. Y también otros arquitectos contemporáneos muy destacados, Herzog y de Boron. En este sentido, creo que va a ser muy, muy interesante escuchar hoy en día la plática de Bernard y creo que es un muy buen alineamiento de los mandatos, de los objetivos entre Mextrópoli y la Embajada de Suiza, de presentar a la tradición, a la innovación y a todos estos valores. En este sentido, muchas gracias a Andrea Griborio y a Miguel Adria para organizar esta plática y sobre todo, muchas gracias a Bernard Tschumi para desde Nueva York en este día muy especial estar con nosotros y compartir esta visión muy creativa del mundo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Leo, por tu presentación. Y pues muy brevemente, para poner en contexto a nuestra audiencia, tenemos casi 500 personas que nos siguen ahora en directo. Pues decirles que Bernard Tschumi es un arquitecto fundamental en el panorama de la arquitectura contemporánea, un arquitecto, escritor y docente. Yo creo que los tres aspectos son fundamentales en su trayectoria y ninguna de ellas es menor. Sus textos, aun cuando prácticamente no tenía obra, aquellos que estudiamos a finales de los 70 eran fundamentales. Inmigrábamos a buscar las publicaciones de Ley en Londres. Ya cuando ganó el Parque de la Villette en el 91, 92, nuestros viajes eran para estar con él, visitar la obra y conocer ese cambio de paradigma fundamental, el final de esa posmodernidad y el regreso a una cierta abstracción de la arquitectura. Siguiendo sus pasos, pues nos llevaría a Colombia, ya cuando él era dean en Colombia, viviendo en Nueva York y atraídos también por sus libros y por obras tan representativas como puede ser el Museo de la Acrópolis en Atenas. Libros de él fundamentales como Red is not a color están en tantas de nuestras bibliotecas y, por cierto, esperemos pronto que podamos editarlo ya en español. Sin duda, un arquitecto fundamental en el panorama de la arquitectura, de la docencia de la arquitectura y en el pensamiento de la arquitectura, en el que ha involucrado otras disciplinas desde su origen, mezclando arquitectura y cine y entendiendo la arquitectura como un fenómeno, no solo un contenedor, sino como un elemento que permite leer desde una perspectiva más antropológica la arquitectura y la ciudad. Bernard, very welcome to be here today with us. We know that today is a very special day, and you were telling that 20 years ago you stayed in New York as today, and also the day reminds you that beautiful sky that you had 20 years ago. Very welcome, and that's your lecture.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I do appreciate the comparison with Le Corbusier and Borromini. I think, in a way, it's interesting to consider how much of an international world we live in. In other words, there is no more specific, national characteristic, but at the same time, there is an interesting dialogue. And there is a dialogue which is worldwide. You are yourself in Mexico. I'm in New York. We are engaging in a conversation. And that's what I would like to do today. It's not really a lecture. I'm not trying to prove a point. But probably talking a little bit about our conditions as people who live in cities more and more. And because of the coincidence of this date of 9/11 today, I believe it's a coincidence, I placed a little bit of an emphasis on this particular horrendous event, which was really also an attack on the city itself. And I think probably we can say that something major changed on 9/11/2001. So let's start. Let's have a few images. Okay, is it all okay? You can sit?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so let me start. You know this, and inevitably that raised an enormous question mark, a question mark that was social, political, urban, and many other points. Many architects, including myself, started to see with a lot of emotion what would be the replacement. And my team, my small team in the office, we developed what we call the Tri-Tower. But very quickly, we realized there was a question. It was the context in which that was. And clearly, we found out that there was quite a difference if the building was in the middle of a cemetery or in the middle of a patriotic, nationalistic park, or simply in Arcadia in a beautiful landscape, or completely different, a sort of Las Vegas scenery. Every time the building itself changing its meanings, and if you place it here, it becomes even something else, and you can give any type of interpretation. I'll let you do that. The juxtaposition that I made was not unlike something which is well known among cinema specialists. It's what is called the Kuleshov effect. The face of the actor never changes, but when it is juxtaposed through montage with a bowl of soup, or a dead child, or a person who is very attractive, then the filmmaker, Kuleshov, asked the audience, what do you read in the eyes of the actor? And they said, oh, he's hungry. Oh, he's sad. Oh, he's full of desire. In other words, there is a strange relationship that happens depending on the context of whatever architecture you built. So I would like to sort of continue in this mode and say that architecture is not so much a knowledge of form, but a form of knowledge, a way to give interpretation to the world. I'll start with probably, I could call it my first project, the Manhattan Transcript. It was done in New York, as I had just arrived, and it was trying to explore this characteristic of the place, and at the same time, the idea of movement and the notation of movement itself. So in other words, first, the park, the Central Park, is extraordinary. And looking at the tripartite mode of notation, where the photograph would describe the action, the middle square would describe the plan, and the third square would describe the movement vectors. Why? Because I always felt that architecture was just as much about movement as it was about spaces and objects, of course. The second episode was another archetype of the city, the street, 42nd Street. The drawing was a very long drawing, 32 feet long, 11 meters long, and using, again, this tripartite notation with at the top the action, what happens in it, in the middle the space itself, in other words, the section, and at the bottom a plan with the movement vectors. So, in other words, describing architecture as something which is simultaneously space, action, and movement. The third one is another archetype. It's the tower, and the tower, the verticality, the idea of gravity, and of course, in this particular case, maybe unconsciously influenced, not influenced because it was done long before the World Trade Center event, the idea of a fall through it. And the last episode was the block, and the block was about a movement notation, different type of movements within spaces. And here, as you can see, the movement is the little dots represent people, and then their trajectory, their movement is solidified. The movement is made like a choreography and turned into walls and then spaces. And then the interrelationship, the collision, if you want, between event, movement, and space, or SEM, space, event, and movement, like semantic, giving the meaning to the place or to the architecture itself. So this idea of developing a concept is very much what I would describe is about what architecture is. In other words, the materialization of a concept. It was the Manhattan transcript were followed by the Parc de la Villette, a major international competition with nearly 500 competitors, all anonymous. And immediately the idea that it was not about a park, but it was about an urban organization was the driver, the starting point of the project. In other words, it can be a grid, it can be concentric, etc., etc. And then this applied to the site itself created an interesting set of circumstances which led to the project itself with the grid, the point grid. But I'll come back to the grid because it's only one of three very important elements in the project. So superimposing these, placing that grid, that was what became, the project became. But as I said, it's made of three elements: the points, the lines, and surfaces. And if you make it into a diagram, a little bit like the diagram of the Manhattan transcript, the system of lines, the system of points, and the system of surfaces, once they're being brought together, they bring something entirely different, which is, in a sense, not a composition, but very much a strategy. So the strategy itself also included a strategy for the building themselves, a strategy of permutations, where different elements could be transformed and would take different configuration that may or may have to do with the program, but generally more with the movement. In other words, ramp, staircase became very much part of the project together, and that's very important, together with the event. In other words, the action here, the building being turned into a place for concerts. The movement vectors are very important in the project as they bring a structure, whether they are elevated, like in this particular case, along the canal, and link different of the follies. So the point grid is an interesting notion. It's not static. It explodes. It's very dynamic. And the important part of the dynamism is, again, that idea of the context. Now, these buildings are not just red buildings, sculptural configuration. They are also engaging in a dialogue with the surrounding. In this particular case, on the foreground, just behind the red follies, 19th century building belonging to the market hall, the once upon a time, and in the background, the 20th century city. So these relations between movement, in this particular case, a bridge that crosses the canal, and the architecture, means that the architecture is not about form, but it's always about a materialization of an idea, of a concept. And this is there to generate activities, in this particular case, a movie theater outdoor, and even at night, the building or the set of building becomes an interesting series. In other words, architecture is not only about, or is not about the condition of design, but about designing conditions, the design of conditions. I'll show you, since in thanks to the very nice introduction of Leo, the ambassador, I'll show one project in Lausanne, Switzerland, which was an interesting, I always felt that there was a size of Lausanne, which is a bit of a metropolis in a film sense. Look at this bridge crossing a valley and sort of walking over a building, or buildings where you could enter on the ground floor and get out on the fourth floor. A strange three-dimensional city. And in a competition that we actually won, we proposed playing with these typological circumstances and built a series of bridges that would be, programmatic bridges, which could sort of contain part of a department store, part of a university, part of a cultural center, and so on. And literally considering that the city was something that you could activate by architectural statements. And here are some of the competition drawings, the first model, one of the moments which are important between below and above, how you connect them, and so on. And eventually, the whole project was not built for a very simple reason, is that there was a change in politics that happened to me a few times. It's one political party that wins, you win with them, and then the party changes and the situation changes as well. But we built one of the bridges and starting to explore that three-dimensionality, going into the ground where the public transport is, in other words, the new subway, the new metro, and the various sort of connection between above and below. So, in other words, architecture is presented as a dynamic moment in culture. It's not static. It's always about generating movement. And then other buildings were being added to it. Here, an information center for that transportation node. We were interested, that's quite early, it's in the early 2000s. We were interested in ecological dimension of architectural envelopes and made it into a green set of stripes. Some of these views. And so it becomes a sort of iconic moment of the city. It is about turning it into a special moment in history. Lefrenois, also playing with circumstances, playing with context. The context in this particular case, well, I'll read that first, because it's again about my questioning the problem of design, that architecture is not necessarily all about design. So I'll read you that sentence. To achieve architecture without resorting to design is an ambition often in the mind of those who go through the unbelievable effort of putting together buildings. So in this particular case, again, we try to deal with what I called a strategy early on with La Villette. The building that on that site was this building, and it had already received its demolition permit. And I thought, wait, that's an interesting building. There's something that I'm interested in, but I'm not interested in form. There's something that I'm interested in is these roofs, could we keep these buildings? So the idea came of putting a large roof on top of the existing building in order to create an in-between. In other words, a space that would cost nothing, that would simply be making it possible to have these buildings function in the late 20th century, when actually they had none of the technological possibilities of our time. So imagine that juxtaposition and superimposition of those two logic, the one of the present and the one of the past. So here is that moment when the building becomes several things at the same time, and it creates what I call that strategy of the in-between. In other words, there is no design. There is the idea of a floating roof above existing facilities. And now it's, by the way, I didn't say it's important, it is an art center. It produces the work of artists, and it has performances and so on. And so they occupy this in-between space and make film, make theater, make events. So it becomes the bringing the movement, in other words, the bridges, the walkway, the passerelle, the walkways, creates an interesting cinematic moment to the building itself. And amusingly enough, this is just at the beginning when people started to use the computer, but these drawings are still done by hand without machines. This one is already the computer beginning. Now, I'll continue this issue of old and new. Now, let's change city. After Paris, after Lausanne, Switzerland, after the north of France, let's go to New York City. There is Columbia University, which has an incredible master plan that is somehow influenced by the Renaissance. And we were supposed to do something in that, to develop a student center. And in that student center, of course, we had in a way to stay respectful to the existing building, as you see on the left, granite and bricks. So we did that. But where at the center, we started to deviate and started to be interested in the fact that on the right, you had Broadway, which was half a story lower than campus. And then we could connect those two halves of the building by a series of ramps that could be literally places of program. In other words, on the ramps are a lot of mailboxes and lounges, and then there's a cinema and so on. And so to connect them in a completely contemporary manner, not unlike the roof at Le Fresnoy, and that these sloped bridges are also the place where people can do performances. Here it's a theater and dance in it. And at the same time, it's a relatively sophisticated piece of engineering, where the pieces were actually manufactured in Europe, in the north of France, and brought by ship to New York and installed on site. And this is the building as it is finished on a few days after the opening. And again, the place become a place of culture. And amusingly enough, even on graduation day, it's the place where the students are waiting to get their diploma. So it's an amusing sort of moment when actually the building is an activator. It activates life. Another project that mixes movement and construction is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sao Paulo. Now, it was a competition in Sao Paulo. As you all know, it's an incredible city, a city of differences. And in an area which was quite strange, next to highways, railway lines, we were asked to design a museum. One of the only possibilities was to do what I called a vertical museum. Now, Sao Paulo is also the city of an incredible architectural tradition, of course, Niemeyer. And so it was very fascinating to work in that context. And we prepared what I call the vertical sketchbook about placing the different parts. By the way, when I work, I use a lot of those quick sketches. Quite often, sometimes they're done at the office table where we are sort of all together, and they take very, very little time. And it's trying to explain how movement was generating the building itself, and then how the envelope was reinforcing the principle of the movement. I'm not going to go into details right now, but simply to show you how the building developed, so as being that correlation between the movement vectors and the envelope itself, as opposed to Le Fresnoy, where the movement vectors, the rams, were separate from the envelope. So here they go together. And it was quite a fascinating building. We were very happy to win it. But here again, there was a political change, and we never had a chance to build that particular museum. So much of it had to do with the museum and the city. That relationship was, again, about movement and spaces. And the final project that I will show you today is again, a project that deals with that issue of movement vectors. And that's the Acropolis Museum. And here I have to bring that unusual circumstance at 8:30 in the morning in New York City. That's where my main office is. I learned that we had won the Acropolis Museum competition. So I went downstairs. I knew there would be a couple of people who would be there early. And as I get down to my office floor on the second floor, someone tells me a plane just crashed against the World Trade Center, and I said, "It's not possible. The weather is blue. It can't be." So we all walked up to the sixth floor where I live, and have a clear view of about 800 meters away where the World Trade Center is, and that's where we saw the whole tragedy. So I never announced, so I announced only later during the day that we had won the competition, and we never celebrated it. But we built the museum this time, no government changes, an incredible group of people actually there. And we were, again, confronted with that challenge of how do you establish a relationship between the context of the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the ruins, incredible ruins on the site. So we were not supposed to touch the ruins. So how do you build a museum when you have that below you? So, and then the last challenge was, the aim was to be able to take all the marbles back, they are at the British Museum on this photograph, and to take them back to the to where they were actually where they belong, in other words, back to Athens. And so here again, the point is, you can design conditions, but you don't choose the context. You choose the concept. And so the project was establishing a dialogue between, on one hand, the Parthenon and the Acropolis at the top, and the ruins, the archaeological ruins at the bottom. And so that superimposition, that system of the strategy of the superimposition, which I've used in other projects, in other words, we talked about Le Fresnoy, we talked about the Parc de la Villette, establishing the strategy of differences and bringing them together. And so that's the building itself as these three parts that act as a sort of dialogue with their circumstances. And throughout the building itself, then you have always that multiple reading. It's not about one single reading. You see the three layers, the one of the ruins, the one of the entrance, and the one of the at the top of the well, and kids love that, of course. And here is again the way the building is conceived as a sequence, as a trajectory, a vector in space. And when you are at certain places, like you can look up, and how could I say, the transparency between the different layers makes it a quite spectacular place. And then that juxtaposition of the old and the new was fascinating, because Greece is a place of earthquakes, so you had all these columns made of concrete. I wanted to have the concrete rough, so it would be in contrast with the polished marble of the statues, and they would engage in the dialogue with one another. And that's it. There's no architecture, there's no design, there's just a materialized concept. And when in the big central atrium, again, trying to keep the design to a minimum, the dots are acoustical traps, they have no design significance. And then very important, the sequence of the marbles, which is an extraordinary 180 meters story of a battle, was placed in the building itself, a little bit like that building, that drawing of 25 years earlier of the Manhattan Transcript. In other words, the only way to look at the drawing is to walk along it. You can't really perceive all of it all at once. In the same way as the only way to see the marbles, the narrative, is to walk along it. And so, amusingly enough, I'm fascinated by the relation between architecture and film. Sergei Eisenstein, one of the incredible early cinema heroes, who invented somehow the notion of montage, used the frieze that you see on the right, the marbles of the ancient Greek, as his inspiration for a very famous film, Alexander Nevsky. In other words, showing that the idea of context is not only about spaces and places, but it's also between different sensibilities, between different ways to think and to express oneself. So here is another view of the sequence of the marbles, and then you arrive at an incredible moment when you see simultaneously the Parthenon, where the sculptures were, and the sculptures themselves, and the fragments. It's too long a story to bring, but there was an explosion and all the bodies were split. And so we staged all that as part of a large a larger story of the relationship between the concept, the context, and the content. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bernard. A great explanation about part of your work. And first of all, I would like to come back to the introduction that I gave about you talking that you are at the same time an architect, but also a writer and a teacher. How is for you the relation between these three overlap disciplines?
Thank you for the question. I don't get that question very often. To me, they are they're totally complementary. I'll start with the writing and the designing, in other words, the architecture. In many ways, in the early days, I would write text simultaneously to projects. And in a way, it was doing the same project, but one time in writing and one time in drawing. And they would sort of be in a constant dialogue back and forth. And sometimes it was the project itself, the drawings, that would influence the writing, or the writing that would influence the drawings. And that back and forth was very, very crucial. And it still happens, but not as directly as it used to. I have to say that quite often the writing is a result of the building, and while in the early day, the building was the result of the drawings, right? So it goes back and forth, but it's a way simply to use different medium. I think you could be an architect and just be a writer. You know, Italo Calvino is an architect when he draws the invisible cities. Right? So that's, and now regarding the teaching, to me, teaching is about asking questions. And asking questions about what we call the dictionary of received ideas, all the cliches, all the fundamental banalities that exist in architecture, and is questioning them and trying to find different approaches to solutions. As I try to show you, you know, in this half an hour of project, every one of them is trying to take the project in a different direction. And that's how I perceive teaching. And I think universities are fantastic places because you still have the freedom of doing that, as opposed to building real buildings where you have to deal with regulations, with the market, with authorities, etc. So the moment of questioning is really what I enjoy with our students when we teach.
Well, we keep talking about all these issues and about your presentation, but let me invite to our plateau our common friend Enrique Norton.
Your presentation, but let me invite to our plateau Enrique Norton. Your presentation, but
¿Qué pasa con el audio?
Okay, all I want to say, hi Enrique, what a nice surprise. Nobody told me you were here.
Seeing you, Bernard, such a long time.
All I want to say, hi Enrique, what a nice surprise.
Well, it's a surprise. Me neither. It's totally improvised. Totally improvised.
well, it's a surprise.
Well, he was
totally improvised. Totally improvised. Really.
Enrique, tienes que apagar el YouTube y quedarte en StreamYard.
A ver, permíteme.
He was in the lecture, and we invited him to the backstage just to involve him in our discussion. And let me ask also, Bernard, about the drawings. It's not writing, it's not necessarily teaching, but is a part of the project itself. It's not just instructions of how a building should be built, but it has its own way and its autonomy, like it happens with the movies. The reference that you shown of Einstein, I think it's great. But your drawings from the beginning, it was a new way to talk about architecture. What's the place for you of the drawings in your process of creation?
Well, for me, it's incredibly important. It's a shortcut. It's really a shortcut. It's a shortcut. I mean, other people have talked about that. It's a shortcut between your mind and the piece of paper, and your hand happens to be the vehicle. I think that's a well-known phenomenon. But in my particular case, I totally depend on it. I think I could, certainly, I've done projects without drawing at all, right? Simply talking about it. But it's rare. Generally, the making, I could say the generation of an idea goes through that process of drawing. But it's not the only way. I think the other way. For me, it's extremely important. And I sort of hesitate to use the word drawing. I don't like the word sketching. I've used the word notation. It's a form of notation. It's a shorthand. It's a shorthand of the mind that takes it into a little closer to the building reality. So it's fairly, it's very important for me.
And Enrique, when Bernard shown this great project in France, I could not think in other projects that, like for example, in your project in Centro Nacional de las Artes, we can talk also with this idea that the space in between. To make a container where you have a space that could happen several things between a small building on the bottom and a huge element, and that envelopes or that covers all the container. Have you ever discussed between you about these issues, about this architecture?
I don't. First of all, let me properly greet Bernard. It's been a very long time, Bernard. I miss you. I didn't know I was going to be talking today. If I knew, I would have also gotten into my black clothes, like both of you. But nevertheless, what happened is that when I got the invitation from, on an email, I wrote back to Miquel because I thought you were coming to Mexico City. And I wanted to see you here. But unfortunately, you're not here. So you're in New York. But I promise that I will be in New York soon, and I will give you a call, and we have a very long drink together. There's a lot to talk and a lot to catch up. Obviously, I'm very honored, Mikel, and I will go back to your question. I'm very honored that you have invited me. I have huge, not only friendship but huge admiration and respect for Bernard. Bernard is no doubt one of the great thinkers of our generation. And as you have clearly said, he's both a great architect, but also a fantastic educator. And he's been an educator both to so many students, but also to all of us, his colleagues. And we all look up to Bernard's thinking and also to Bernard's representation of his thinking through his words and through his writing and through his drawings. This was a great talk, Bernard. I appreciate it very much. Before I go to your question, let me just stop in something that really brought my attention, which is a very interesting thought Bernard has brought up by saying that at the end, we as architects are not really, the main goal is not really about designing buildings or even about designing, but it's about creating strategies and about the materialization of ideas. And it's really amazing the clarity, how Bernard's ideas and Bernard's thought eventually become wonderful places. So, and we could go through any one of your projects, and it's true for every one of them. I've had the luck, the honor to visit most of the projects that Bernard has shown. And yes, as we know, photographs never show the wealth of the experience. So congratulations, Bernard, and thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. And coming back to your question, Mikel, I do think that, obviously, a lot of our, and not only Bernard and I, but many of us, all of us that are somehow working on architecture, obviously share inclinations and share ideas, and we never know really where all the ideas come from. We all, in this world of extensive communication and tremendous media porosity, obviously we're all looking at everybody and we're all learning from everybody. So I'm also honored that you would think that some of my projects, I would say there's at least 2 or 3 that I was also thinking when Bernard showed the Fresnoy project, which is, yes, the Center of the Arts, but also probably the project we have built in Acapulco, where we had built a very large roof and then a series of buildings under that roof. But really, the important thing is neither the roof or the buildings, but it's the void or the interstice that gets created in between the two. And the possibility of that void, it's really the immateriality of that space that really brings to life that experience. So I do appreciate very much you making that parallel and making me realize where some of those ideas may also come from.
Thank you, Enrique. I think that, well, I have to say that we have a lot of people attending this lecture. People from Bolivia, people from Brazil, obviously a lot of people in Mexico that are very pleased to listen you, Bernard, and surprise also and thanks to Enrique to share with us this time. I would like to ask you about Bernard about what coming back to the date that this 9/11. What's your feeling 20 years later in this of this event that again it's in some way it's very close to your way of understanding architecture. It's a way of vectors. It's a way of movement and something that happens in some way. It's has a extraordinary choreography. I mean, behind the tragedy of the act, in some way could be a project drawn by you or designed. What do you think about it?
Let me present my answer to a question in two parts. The first part is really addressing what Enrique Norton said a few minutes ago. You said, Enrique, something that I thought was very beautiful, which was the fact that there was a way ideas are floating around. They are there, and we are a number of architects, but also filmmakers, writers, sometimes even politicians, who each use one another in order to construct the next moment. And this conversation is incredibly important. It's a conversation which often is between people who don't even know one another. And so what I feel is that people of, I hate the word generation, by the way, but that's the way it is. We were all born more or less around the same time. And hence, we established that network of ideas and of consciously or not, quite often it's not conscious. So that's very important. And the reason I bring it up is not only because I appreciate Enrique's point, but because I think at 9/11, there was a sharp break between one conversation and then another conversation. The way people look at the city is now very different. I think there's something happened which we are only realizing now, that the city will never be the same. But it's not only because of 9/11. 9/11 just becomes a little bit of a symbol, like, you know, the end of the Berlin Wall became a symbol at a certain time about ideologies and things of this sort. But since the early 21st century, the city has become less social, has become less spatial, and that may have to do with the economy of cities, or with the new technologies, in other words, the internet and so on, and these days, COVID. So one is realizing that the conversation that took place during the second half of the 20th century cannot be the same as the conversation which is now happening in the first half, or at least the first quarter of the 21st century. And so it has good parts, but some where I'm really interested in being able to bridge these different conversations, including conversation that took place at the end of the 19th century. A sort of generosity of railway station and department stores, places that were extraordinary urban places, which today do not quite happen in the same manner. I'm not going to give example in New York City, but I was more excited about what was being built in New York in the early 1900s than in the early 2000s.
Enrique, would you like to comment about the change of the city and the change of the wall after this 9/11? Tienes el micro apagado.
Thank you very much, Miquel. You know, I completely agree with Bernard. You know, I also happen to be in New York when 9/11 occurred. I was also there. I was, as a matter of fact, not far from where Bernard was, and it was obviously a very shocking moment. Then I remember also very well when Bernard presented his ideas for 9/11. I happened to be part of the jury that was, trying to find a scheme that would become the memorial, the very, I would say, watered down memorial that we have now. So I was involved in that event for a couple years in a very intense manner. And I completely agree, the conversation has changed. Not only the conversation, but the way we experience the city and the way we experience architecture has changed. And it's been many things. We must admit that there have been also a mix of feelings that we didn't know about before 9/11, as citizens, as part of the city. And those are sometimes conditions of different kind of awareness, or even conditions of different kind of fear. We discovered also the fragility of us as a community, and for the United States, the fragility of their territory, which was also a very important issue. The invincible New York wasn't that invincible anymore, and it created a huge scar. And that obviously created a completely new conversation, as Bernard has pointed out. And now we experience the city in a very different manner. I would also say that the beginning of the 20th century brings a different condition, which is a technological change, a very important technological change. Something that I'm sure many of the people that are listening now have realized is that Bernard doesn't present in his talk renderings or videos, or any of those things. It's drawings and photographs of buildings and spaces, mostly. Like, we all belong to a very different, and I won't use also the word generation, but of a very different moment in the history of humanity. So, yeah, 9/11 does create a cusp, a moment that changes somehow very differently the way we think and the way we look at the world, and very especially the way we experience architecture in the city.
Well, great comments. And before finishing this talk today, I have some people that ask me about your relation with the red. Red is not a color; it's the title of a great and sick book that I mentioned that we are fascinated with the idea to publish it in Spanish. But why red? Why all the pavilions at the Billet are red? What's your connection with the Swiss flag? It's
Miguel, you probably know the answer already. It's the question I never answer to, right? So listen, thank you. In reality, I'll give you a hint. It's your projection that will give you the answer. There is not one single answer. Red is not a color. So listen, thank you for that opportunity. I enjoyed doing it with all of you. Indeed, it was improvised due to the coincidence of the 9/11 date, but it was also a little bit of a conversation, and I'm very pleased of talking to you, Miguel, talking to you, Enrique, and being together with all the viewers of this particular short event. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Gracias, Enrique. Gracias también a la Embajada Suiza que nos presentó y nos acompaña en este evento. Y pues estén atentos, mextropoli.mx. Este mes tendremos otras conferencias ya presenciales, también de gran nivel. Estén atentos, asistan también a las exposiciones que tenemos. Es el lugar más seguro que hay, un museo. Y pues sigan construyendo arquitectura con nosotros. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.